kick things off here. So yeah, appreciate everybody joining up. Hello everybody, my name is John Pozan. Thanks for giving us a piece of your Thursday. Today we're going to be talking about Integration Manager. So pretty excited to discuss this topic. I know it's one that has been pretty commonly requested by a variety of our customers, so excited to discuss that. A few housekeeping items, but maybe before I do that. So of course my name is John Pozan. My role at ADEM and GP365 is mainly to run the sales and marketing operations of the company. I also have Jason with me, who is a very long time GP user. I think going on close to 20 years. Jason, that's about right? Am I dating you?
You're aging me.
I know, and we have accounting people who are very good at math, so I'm sure they've guessed exactly your age. So with that, yeah, of course, no problem. A few housekeeping items before we get started today. So the first thing I wanted to mention here is that most of our time will be spent inside of GP, not PowerPoint. So everyone can rest at ease. I'll spare you from as many slides as I possibly can today. Another item is we unfortunately cannot hear you. So all participants are on mute. However, we do ask that you feel free to ask any questions. You're going to see a box, I think, on your right-hand side that should enable you to put in a question. Feel free to ask the question at any point throughout the presentation. We won't be answering them until the end, so it's not that we're ignoring you. Well, I guess we're kind of ignoring you, but only until the end of the PowerPoint or presentation, at which point we'll answer all of your questions. And last thing is we are going to, of course, be doing our usual draw for a variety of Tim Horton gift cards, so stay tuned after the PowerPoint. We'll always send out the winners. So with that, yeah, we're ready to roll. So today's sort of flow is to briefly tell those of you who aren't aware of who we are and what we do a quick intro. Most of our time, as I mentioned, will be inside of GP. Jason's prepared a variety of kind of scenarios and different topics that he thought would be quite interesting to everybody. And we'll end off with a few things that are in the future. So of course these events and training sessions is something that we do regularly, and I wanted to talk about two really popular ones that are coming up in the next couple months. And then of course we'll leave off with our questions or your questions. All right, so you'll see there a beautiful picture of a few of our team members at last year's holiday party. Our holiday party this year is actually tomorrow, so that picture is unfortunately a little bit outdated, but I'm very excited for the holidays. I hope all of you are as well. I actually have my first child recently born, so it's going to be my first sort of Christmas or holiday season, you know, with someone other than my wife and I, so I'm excited to see him staring at presents and, you know, all those fun, exciting things that you do the first year with a newborn, like be woke up every 30 minutes. So yeah, very stoked. Now, what do we do? So we've been actually servicing Dynamics GP and CRM for close to 20 years. We've worked with a variety of organizations to implement GP, support GP, you know, increase the use of an existing GP implementation. So we kind of do it all. In those 20 years of servicing GP, we've established, I guess you could say, a list of kind of things that people aren't overly enthused about with GP. So things that are kind of either gaps in functionality or items that may, you know, cause some inconvenience. So because of that, we've actually created a product, GP365, which is meant to sort of fill a lot of those gaps. So this product is a completely cloud-hosted version of GP. It's something that, you know, we're pretty excited about. This presentation is not about that. However, if you do have interest or, you know, would like to know more, you know, reach out to us. I'm happy to set up a call and kind of fill you in a little bit more on what it is and what it can do. So with that, I wanted to maybe, just before I turn it over to Mr. Jason, I wanted to ask you a little question here, Jason, and I think it's pretty timely. So the question is as follows. How does Santa's accountant value his sleigh?
Oh God. Okay. How does Santa's accountant value it?
Any idea?
No, not a clue.
Okay. Net present value. Huh?
Let's just move on then. So let's just
okay. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you, John. So before we jump into actual Integration Manager here, let's just go over what we're going to talk about. So first I'm going to sort of give a high-level overview of what Integration Manager is and does. Then we'll talk about what you can integrate with. And then I'm going to give a couple of scenarios. Now this is an introductory course, so this isn't meant to be going into the more advanced functionality of Integration Manager. It's just to give everybody an idea of how it works and what you can do with it. So with that, Integration Manager basically allows you to import data from external sources into GP. Now those external sources can be ODBC. For those of you that aren't database people, that would be SQL, Oracle, things of that nature. XML, which for those of you that aren't programmers is extended markup language, which allows you to embed data basically inside of a page, web page. And finally, the one that we're probably most familiar with, CSV or comma-separated values, which is Excel. So they can be comma-separated or tab delimited, whatever type of delimitation you're going to use in Excel, it's supported. So the concept with Integration Manager is that somebody with some level of experience in GP and maybe a little bit of technical knowledge will go and define and map out how the fields from the source are going to be imported into GP. They then save that as an integration that can be run on demand by other users or themselves. But the point is the people that run it don't actually need to understand how the integration works. They need to know some things like where to put the file to import and things of that nature, but they don't need to understand all the background workings of Integration Manager. So typically it's going to be more of not an IT person, but somebody with a little bit of sort of database knowledge that creates and maps everything, and then all the rest of the users are able to run them. It's great for simple imports. Typically when we do a new implementation, we'll use Integration Manager to import, your master data, opening journal entries, opening payables entries, all of that sort of thing. So it's a very easy tool to use, and it's just very efficient for, simple integrations. Integration Manager actually runs through the fields on the form. So essentially what happens when you run an integration, it's kind of like running a macro. So it goes through all of the fields on a form. For example, if you're doing a payables transaction entry, it goes through each field and actually executes the business logic on each of them. So it enforces the business logic that exists in GP and makes sure that you don't make any mistakes in terms of the data integrity. Integration Manager doesn't come with GP natively unless you've purchased the customization suite. So depending on when you acquired GP, way back in the days, the early days, Integration Manager was sold as a standalone module. But more recently, with the transition to business ready licensing, and then now we're on the GP perpetual license model, it is part of what's called customization suite, which includes eConnect and Integration Manager. So if you don't have it available, check with your administrator. It might be that they just didn't install it. But absent that, of course, you can feel free to reach out to us and we can help you try to get it acquired. Now, if you're going to be running really sophisticated integrations on an ongoing basis that are more complex than what we can handle here, the product that we would recommend, and this is a plug for our friends over at E1, it would be SmartConnect. And we'll talk a little bit more about SmartConnect a little bit later, but SmartConnect has a whole bunch of extensions to the functionality of Integration Manager, and it's a great tool for doing the more complex ongoing integrations between different products. So what can we integrate with? So inside GP, we have the following series, and I'm not going to read them all off to you. I'll let you take a look quickly yourselves, but at a high level, it exposes most of the series and modules in GP for integration. The ones that would be missing off the top of my head would be manufacturing and things like user imports unfortunately can't be done. But financial, payables, receivables, inventory, fixed assets, and project accounting are all available at some level for integration. So it's pretty robust in terms of what you can do with it. So maybe with that, we'll actually get out of the PowerPoint and hop over to GP. So things have gone right. Everybody should see my screen in a moment, which should be the GP homepage. Now I want to talk a little bit about the logistics of how Integration Manager works before we get into it. And this is pretty important actually, because if you make a mistake, you can cause some damage. So you need to have GP launched before you start running any integrations. So GP has to be running on your desktop before you can actually integrate anything. And one of the reasons for that is it chooses the company, and you can see here down at the bottom, I'm logged into Fabricam. So if I were to open Integration Manager right now and run an integration, it's going to integrate into Fabricam. Now, if I wanted to integrate into a different company, of course, you would come into your company selection window and change it, and then that would be where Integration Manager is pulling the data into. So it's important to make sure you're in the right company. For those of you that are building integrations, it's usually done in a test company first. So if you have a test company database, just be sure that you're logged into that test company, because otherwise you could overwrite potentially master data in your live company, and that's not going to make anybody happy. So now, there are different ways to launch Integration Manager depending on how your IT administrator has set you up. But I recommend actually launching it from inside GP itself. It just ensures that you actually have GP open, so make sure that you haven't missed a step. But it can also be run as a standalone application. But to get at it from GP, you're just going to go to the GP menu, Tools, Integrate, and then Integration Manager. And this brings up our Integration Manager window. So before we get into the actual mappings and all that good stuff, I'm just going to jump back to my desktop, and we're going to look at this file that I have here. It's a customer file, so it's an Excel document that has a bunch of customer information in it. So it's very simple. I have my customer ID, my customer name and address information and phone, and I want to bring this over into GP. So the first thing I need to do is I need to make sure I'm saving this in a format that's recognizable by by Integration Manager. So we're going to go up to File, and we're going to Save As, and I'll just browse. And what you need to do is you need to make sure you're not selecting Excel. It needs to either be, it can be a CSV, comma-separated value, or in this case we were using text, which is tab delimited. So once you've saved it in that format, you can put the file in a location, and I recommend you set up a sort of staging point somewhere on whatever server or workstation you're doing this from, so that you can reuse the same folder over and over again. But it does need to be saved in one of those formats, because it doesn't recognize Excel natively. So once you've saved your file in the correct format, we'll hop back over to Integration Manager here. And I'm just going to click Open Integration. So this is the main Integration Manager window. You know, when you first open it, you have the choice of creating a new integration or opening an integration. This lets you explore all the objects, which we'll talk about later. But I'll go ahead and click Open Integration. And when you first install Integration Manager, it comes with a whole bunch of pre-built sample integrations, which are what we're going to use today. So the first thing I wanted to do is a simple example of customers. And the reason I want to use customers is just because it's a fairly flat example in GP. There's not a lot of required child nodes and things like that that complicate the integration. So I'm going to pick customer, and I'm going to select Open. And this brings us to the main integration window. Let me maximize this. So along the left here, we have the nodes of the integration. So the very top is the source, and then we have our destination, and then we have the mappings. So if we double click on customers, which is my source that's been defined, it brings up the properties for that source. Now you can see here it's pointed at a file, which is in my IM samples folder, and it's called customer.txt. We have to tell Integration Manager how the file is delimited, whether it be comma, space, or tab. It supports all of those. Or you can use a custom character, for example, a star, asterisk, or whatever you want. And then we need to mark this off if our source file has a column with the first column having the names of the column, which mine does. And if we click on columns, you'll see here that it automatically brings all of the columns it finds in that file into the source file. And these other three we'll come back to and talk about during our next sample. But these are the two, basic and most important aspects of the source file. One thing I do recommend you do before you go any further with the mappings is just to make sure that the file is working. You can right-click on that source file and click Preview. And if things have been set up correctly, it should actually preview the data that's in your Excel file. And you can see here it even knows that the header names along the top. So once you verify that your customer file is mapped out is built correctly, we need to tell GP or Integration Manager where we want to dump the information in GP. Now this one's already selected at customer. There's nothing to do here. This is more for informational purposes, but essentially when you click on add destination, it will bring up that list that was in the PowerPoint. So you can select any of those series and modules to import data into. And in our case, of course, it is just customer data. Now, something from an informational standpoint you could look at in here, it tells you, what attributes this particular destination in GP has. So whether it allows you to insert and update are the important ones, same thing with delete, and whether it allows a duplicate key in that table. So really not much to do in the destination other than tell it where to put it. The really fun stuff is in the destination mapping itself, and I'll double click this. Now don't be overwhelmed, there's a lot going on here. Along the left, we have the nodes of the integration itself. So these are the, from GP, the different nodes that are available for customer record. And if I click on customer, you see that's what we're looking at now, but if I click on accounts, so this would refer to the customer accounts on the customer record. So just to give you a visual on that, let me hop back over to GP. We'll go to sales, and we'll go to our customer window. And I'll just go to the first record. So the main window here would basically be what you're seeing on the first node where it says customers in Integration Manager. And then when I clicked on accounts, that would be the equivalent of clicking on the accounts button. So as you can see, there's more than one account for a customer. So it's a one-to-many relationship. So one customer will have many accounts assigned to it, and those accounts obviously have different roles. The first one here is the accounts receivable account. The second one is the default sales account, and so on. So that's why there's those child nodes below. And if we go back to Integration Manager, you'll see that there are nodes for all of the different buttons and their children. So these are what we would call children of the customer record. Now, if we go back up to customer and I click on options, you'll see there aren't any options for this because it's a very straightforward module. There's no complexity there. But if I go to my accounts, for example, now this is a child record, so it needs to know where it's pulling the data from. So in this case, we're saying use default. And actually, we haven't really mapped any accounts in this particular integration. As you recall, my file only had address and telephone information in it, and that didn't even have any accounts. But if we look at addresses, now we see that it is pulling from the record source using the record set customers, which is, again, the same flat file. So basically, we're telling Integration Manager, you're getting all the data, both for the customer record itself and for all the addresses from that same Excel file. So let's go back and look at this main window. So on the left here, this is where you map all of your fields. So on the left side here, these are the destination in GP. So these are all the fields available on the customer form. This is the rule it's going to use to populate that field. And then this is where to find the data if you're linking it to an external source. So some of the options you have here are use default, use source field. So use default, what that does, and I'm going to give you a simple example. You can see here under short name, I'm setting use default. If we go back to GP, and I'll just show you the behavior of what use default does. So if I go here and I create a new record, so I'm just going to go GP365, so I'm creating a new customer record. When I tab off that, and I populate the name field, so I'll put GP365 sample record. Now when I tab off of this, that activates the business logic for this field. So when I tab, you see how it automatically populates short name with a truncated version of the name. So if I leave it set to use default, that's the behavior that Integration Manager will mimic. So in other words, left at set default, if I had a record with this name in it, it would populate this in here. So that's what the use default means. I'll discard that. Let's go back to Integration Manager. So the other option, use source field, so that obviously means we're going to point it at a column from my Excel file, which we've done for these other fields here. And if I choose that, it brings up this ellipses button here, so I can click and select the field from my Excel file. It's pulling this from the column names of my Excel file. So some of the other options would be blank, which obviously means don't put anything in there. Use input. Now what this will do is for every record in the Excel file, it'll stop and it'll pop up a dialog box to the user to say, what do you want to put in? So not very commonly used because obviously for large record sets, it's going to stop at every single record and ask you what you want to put in, so it's not very practical. But for small record sets, it's perfectly fine. Use constant allows you to define a single value that you want it to populate for every record. and I'll come back to an example of that in a little while. And then this would be an advanced topic, use script. It allows you to build what's called a VB script, a Visual Basic script. Very simply put, let's say you wanted your short name to be a concatenation of the country code and the customer ID. So you could build a script that would say, okay, take the country code and then concatenate customer ID and place that in the script, and that's how it would know how to populate the field. And it lets you do a whole bunch of other things, like you can do constraints and conditional things, and so it's pretty powerful when you get into it, but it's a topic we won't be covering today. So I'm just going to go back and set this to use default, and I'll save. So just very simply, what we're mapping here is we have our customer ID field, and we're pulling that from the source field in the Excel file from the customer ID column. And then for hold and inactive, we're using default, and then we go down to name. Again, we're using a source field from the Excel file from the column called customer name, and so on and so forth. And then if I flip over to addresses, because again, there can be multiple addresses for a single customer, right? And just to give you a visual on that, if I go back to my customer record, and I'll just go to the first record here. When I click on address ID, see how there's a lookup? And I can look up, and there can be multiple addresses associated with this customer. So that's why it needs to be split as a separate node, because you can have more than one address for each customer. In this case, we're doing a flat entry, so we're just saying to use the same record set, and we're pulling it from the Excel file for the most part, and then using defaults for all the rest. So let's give this a run and see what happens. So to run an integration, you just go up to the top and click the Run button. And it's going to bring up this window and show you the progress as it goes. We think, the typical time per record is about 3 seconds per record. That's sort of it depends on the performance of the server you're running. But for very large record sets, do recommend splitting them up. Sometimes they can take a long time to run. So we can see here in the messages that we've had, first it establishes the record count and beginning, and then we got an error here. And it says that Coho Wine 0001 already exists. It cannot insert. And that's because there's already a record with that name in the table. So it completed with partial success. And then down here, it's going to give you the statistics. So there were 3 records in the query. It attempted all 3 of them. 2 of them got integrated, and 1 of them failed. Now let's take a look at our source file again. So if I go back, so we had Alpine 0001. This one that it said already existed. And then Wingtip 001 should have integrated as well. So let's go to GP and check out and see what we see. So if I go to my customer, and I'll type in Alpine 0001, there we go. So the name is Joe, Main Street, Unit 111. So Alpine, Main Street, Unit 111, USA, looks good. Phone number populated with the right information, it sure did. So there we go. Now, with the way I've built this integration, it's pretty basic, and like if we go to the accounts, nothing's populated. Not sure what the practical value would be of an integration like this, because you're still going to have to come in and map all the accounts. So maybe we'll add a little bit of complexity to this. One thing we can do is we could populate, if you've made classes for your customer records. So in this example data, we have a whole bunch of classes that are predefined. Let's take a look at this Canada, Ontario one. So you can see here we've got, a credit limit set up and finance charges and all that good stuff. And if I go to accounts, most of them are all mapped. So maybe the solution to that problem would be to actually populate a class on our import. So we should deal with that before we do another run. And also, we have that duplicate record we should look at. So I'm going to delete this one because we're going to reintegrate. And we'll go look at the other one, Wingtip. So there we go. Comparison, we've got our PAT, primary, Maple, box 333. So all the information came in, but again, we're not getting enough. I go to the options, there's no credit limits, none of that good stuff is there. So we'll delete this one as well. And we should take a look at the one that it complained about being a duplicate, so Coho Wine. Okay, so we have this Coho Wintry, which obviously is a different company than this Coho Winery. Now, we would have a couple of choices here. We could either give it a different customer ID, because that's what it's failing on, or in the case of today, I'm going to use this as an example to show you how you could update the record if you wanted to change it. So we're going to go ahead and leave this one in place, and we're going to close it. And I'm going to go back to my integration. Something we didn't cover is once you open the integration itself, there's this properties button up at the top, and this is kind of important. So if I click on it, nope. Oh, sorry, I have to click on the top node there. Sorry, I wasn't selected a customer. So when you, sorry, to show what was going wrong there, you have to select the top node to tell it you want to open the properties of the integration. So I'll click that and then click properties. And what we're looking at here is this. This is an important one. So destination edit mode. In particular, that's an important one. So we're telling Integration Manager that with this integration, we only wanted to insert records. In other words, if it comes across a duplicate, it should not try to update it. It should fail. But there are other options, which would be update only. So if you're creating an integration to update all of your customer addresses and you don't want to accidentally integrate any new records, you would set it to update only. And if you want it to do both, there's that option as well. So what we'll do is we'll change it to insert and update, and then when we rerun it, even though it finds that Coho winery, it should just overwrite the information with the information from my integration file. And down here is a couple of settings that are important too. So basically, Integration Manager has a threshold for when it will fail an integration and when it will stop warning. So right now we're saying if you come across 10 errors during the integration, stop the integration. And this is really important, especially when you're first setting it up and you're testing, because otherwise, if you have a big record set, you could end up sitting there and waiting for half an hour for it, even though you know it's not working. So I would set this at a low threshold while you're developing the integration, and then you can increase it once you've refined everything and it's working properly. And the same thing goes with the maximum number of warnings. So the difference between an error and a warning is something that is soft. Like, for example, if a field in your Excel file is 30 characters, but the destination in GP only accepts 20, it will truncate it automatically, well, depending on the setting that you can change, but it will throw a warning. So if you want it to stop after a certain number of warnings, you could set that as well. For our purposes today, 10 and 10 is just fine. So we're going to make a couple of quick changes here. So we've already changed it to insert and update. And the other thing is, I mentioned, well, it's bringing in the customer information, but it's not populating accounts or any of that other good stuff. So I'm going to go back to my mapping, and I'm going to say, let's bring that class in. So we're going to go to our class field, and I'm going to change this to use constant. And now in here, I'll populate that class that we had that we saw when I was looking in GP. So it was CAN-OMMBSK-T6. So now what it should do is for every record that it imports on the class ID, it's going to use this as a constant. And because we have everything else set to use default, as you know, when you populate a class on a customer record, it will pull all of the information available from the class and populate it on that customer record. So let's go ahead and click Save. And we'll close this window. Another thing to note, by the way, that's a common problem, if you have a window open in GP, like just even open but blank, and you go to run an integration, it's going to fail because you can't have any GP windows open at the time you run the integration. Again, because the way this works is it's actually running it like a macro, so if there's windows open, it interrupts the macro. So we have to make sure all our windows in GP are closed, and now we'll go back and try running it again. It still failed on the Coho wine. I must have made a mistake. But anyway, in any case, now we have two successfully integrated and one still failed. Let me just make sure I had actually changed that flag. Nah, it didn't take. So insert an update, apply, OK, and let's run it again. And now we have 3 successes. So let's close this and we'll go check out and see what we got in GP. So we're going to go back to our customer account record. And let's start with that one that was a duplicate. So it was Coho Wine. Before it was Coho Wintry, I think. And now it's Coho Winery. So it looks like it took it. Now, also note it populated our class. And because we put a class on it, if I go to options, it's taking all the information from the class, and that includes all of the account information. So now we've actually got a viable sort of import, from my opinion. So take a look at one more. We don't need to look at all three. The other one was called, what did we have? Alpine. Again, it worked the second time, and it brought the class in, and we've got all our accounts and all the good stuff. So that's an example of a very simple integration, flat, and it's very commonly used. Customer and vendor data is one of the most typical integrations that we see being performed. Now let's take a look at one that's a little bit more complicated and very relevant. So we're going to do a payables integration entry. This is another very commonly requested integration. So for this example, I've got another source file here, and I'll close this customer integration and save our changes. Let's minimize this. So I've created this PMTRX file. Again, it's a tab delimited file, text file. And what we have, and I'll just expand some of these columns so we can see all the info. And what we have here, if you look at it, is payables information all in one file. And the reason I say that is because you see here how invoice number 1 is being repeated 3 times. Well, that's because technically on a payables transaction, there are usually multiple distributions associated with it. There's always going to be at least 2, but in this case there's 3. So the 2 would be, for example, the purchase, which is the debit account, and then the payable, which is the credit account. And this one actually has a cash application. This is what would go in the check amount. And you see how it has, so this is being repeated, these first, what are they, 6 columns here? So doc type, description, vendor, doc date, doc number, they're being repeated over and over again for each record in the file. And when you get over to account, now each of these is different for each of those records. So basically it's kind of like this is the header. This is the header of the payables transaction, and this is the distributions. So to go to GP, just to give you a visual on that, so we're going to go to purchasing, and we'll click on transaction entry, which is what we're importing into. So this is the header part of the record here. So this is where you have your vendor ID, you have your description, which we had in our file, you have your document number, and your purchase amount. And then within each of those, and I don't know if there's any records here to play with, no. Within each of those, you have the distributions button, which for those of you familiar with GP, and we'll come back and look at it after we do the integration, that's where the debits and the credits are recorded for the general ledger. So what we do in that case, this is what we call a single file integration. It's also possible to have 2 Excel files, one that would hold or house this header information, and a second one that would house the distribution information. So it's possible to do it either way. Simpler example is to put it all in one file, but just bear in mind that you're going to see a repetition of the header for each of the child records. Now, one question that often comes up is, well, how do I know what this distribution type number is supposed to be? Because that's not in English, that's a number. So something that I can show you in Integration Manager. So we'll click Open Integration, and this one's called I think Payable PM Transaction. So something that you can do to look at it is click on the mappings, and we're going to go to our distributions, which is where that distribution type is recorded. And you'll see here you have a distribution type, and it says use source field, and it's getting it from our file. But if I change it to use constant just for a minute, and then I can click on this drop menu, because it's not, even though I told it to use a constant, I can't freeform type. There's only a limited number of options. So instead of giving you a freeform field, it gives you a drop list. And fortunately, it gives you the number and the type, so you can see visually which is which. So just referring back to our file, so this first line here where we're doing the $500, and it looks like it's going against an inventory account or something. So this 6 refers to purchase. So that's the purchase side of the transaction. That's going to be our debit. And then if I go back to the Excel file, the next line down is a 2. And my guess is it's going to be the payable. Oops, is going to be the payable side. Correct. So that's one way for you to figure out which distribution type is which. Oops, I need to close all the way out. And help you to build the integrations Excel files. So looking back at our file, we'll jump into Integration Manager, and I'll show you how this is mapped. So now you'll notice under sources, instead of having one flat file, I have 2. Let's just take a quick look at both of those. So the first one here is pointing at this PMTRX file, which is the one I have open on the desktop there. And the second one is pointing at the same file, and that's why we call it a single file integration. It's using one file, but you're splitting it up virtually into the header and the body. So going back to the header, the way that that would work is, we already covered this, so it's tab delimited, and these are the columns that are there. There's nothing to do with filters, but what is unique to this type of integration is that we need to sort it. So first thing we're going to do is find a common, what's the common pivot point between the header and the distribution? And of course that would be the document number, because that's going to be unique. So what we're doing is we're sorting the Excel file by document number, and then if you look at how we're grouping it, so we're saying doc type, vendor, doc date, doc number, purchase amount, check amount, and description. And going back to our Excel file, that would represent this, which is always the same for the header. So we're grouping those together on the virtual header that we've created in Integration Manager. And then we look at the distribution file, and again, it's the same thing, tab delimited, commas, same columns. But when I go to sorting, same thing, we're sorting it by document number, but now we're grouping it by a different set of information, which is the other half of this file, this. And the only common point between the two of them is going to be doc number. So if I go back to Integration Manager, down at the bottom here, you'll see we also have doc number. So that's the only column that's common to both the header and the distribution. And you'll notice that when you have this two-file arrangement like this, this node pops up called Query Relationships. Now this is a very simple thing, but you need to tell Integration Manager how the two are related to each other. So what we do is we've related doc number to doc number. And literally all you do is you left click and hold down and drag over and drop. And it'll automatically create this little arrow for you, pointing so that you have one header to many distributions. So that's all you need to do to create a a single file relationship. And then, of course, we have our destination, which, again, there's nothing to configure in here. It's just telling Integration Manager where you want to dump the data. In this case, it's a payables transaction. And then finally, we have our mappings. So this is a little bit more complicated. So if we look at the top node here, which is our payables transaction entry, a couple of important things that we didn't see with customers that we're going to see here. If I go to Options, you have to tell Integration Manager how to handle different scenarios. So option when there's a missing batch. In other words, if you've put a batch in your integration and it can't find a matching batch in GP, what should it do? Well, I've chosen add a new batch, which essentially would create a batch. But you can also cancel the document. So if you want to use batch, an example of when you would set this to cancel document is if you want to make sure that the batch pre-exists, maybe you want to set controls or things like that on it, you can set it to cancel document. And that way, if the batch hasn't been pre-configured for you, it'll just stop and say the batch doesn't exist. But in our case, add new batch is correct. Another thing that needs to know is what do I do if the vendor is going to, if this record will put the vendor over its credit limit. So in our case, we're saying override, but the other option, of course, is to cancel. That wouldn't really apply as much to the vendor side as it would to the receivable side, but if you're doing receivables transactions, you may want to set it to cancel document so that it doesn't attempt to import documents for customers that would put them over their credit limit. So we'll leave those two settings as they are and go back to our field map. So you can see here, our voucher number we're getting use default, which means, again, it's going to use the behavior that it would see inside GP natively. So if I go back to our purchasing and I click on transaction entry, when I open the window, it automatically populates the voucher number. So use default is going to replicate that behavior in Integration Manager. In other words, it will automatically assign the voucher number. And we're using that same setting for intercompany, and document type we're getting from the source field. So again, this is one of those scenarios where you need to know what that maps to, and you could just change this to use constant to see what the different doc types are. In this case, in our Excel file, the document type is 1, which I know from experience is invoice. So this represents a vendor invoice. Document type 5 refers to a vendor credit note. And then for our batch ID, we're using a constant, and so basically we want to dump all these transactions into a batch in GP called payables batch. The rest are pretty self-explanatory. We're mapping the date to the document date using defaults for most of the rest. But basically, wherever you see a field mapped here, that's getting from the Excel file itself. Now let's look at what's happening with our distributions. So again, there is a one-to-many relationship between our payables transaction and our distributions. So we need to go to options and tell Integration Manager where to get that information from. Because we're using a single file, we're pointing it at the same source, which is our PM distribution right here. So it's the same file, but a separate source, virtual source. And then within the mappings, we're telling it to get the account from, you'll notice it concatenates because it thinks this is a child of the header. So it's putting PM distributions dot account. What all that means is that it's looking at this source file, which is the same file, and then this is the account name, which is account. So we're taking it from account, distribution type, and then debit and credit. So that's really all we should need to do to get this integration to run. So let's close this off and give it a go. So looks like we had a perfect success here. So we queried 3, attempted 3, and 3 were successfully integrated. So we're going to go ahead and close this and go back to GP, and let's see what we got. So we're going to click on transaction entry, and then I'll just click the lookup on the voucher number. So there's some document, there's a test batch that was there from before. Here's my batch with the 3 documents for Advanced, Beaumont, and Central. And if I click on that, you can see it's pulling over. This was the credit memo, the one that started with a 5, so that would be referring to this guy here for Advanced 001. So we should see a credit for $40, which is exactly what we're getting. And if we go to the distributions, it's populating the correct accounts with the debits and the credits. So that's really, in a nutshell, sort of how Integration Manager works. Obviously, when you get into the more complicated integrations like sales order processing and purchase orders and receipts, it can get quite elegant in terms of how you design it. But the principles are the same throughout. And once you get used to using it, it has its quirks. I'm not going to lie to you. Integration Manager is a bit of a quirky product. But once you get used to using it and you know how to read the error messages, it's pretty straightforward. And it can really accelerate your data entry. So with that, we'll hop back to our our PowerPoint. And I wanted to take you through a quick step. This is another plug for our friends over at E1, just to give you, these are not all the differences between the 2 products, but very, very high level and what I would consider the most important ones between SmartConnect and Integration Manager. So Integration Manager, as I mentioned earlier, is included with the customization suite. It's released by Microsoft. It's part of the GP family, whereas SmartConnect is a third-party product, but E1 is a very reputable developer for GP. They've been around forever, and they make a ton of products. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Integration Manager can only be run on demand, so somebody needs to come in and click that Run button. Now, for your end users that you don't want mucking around with the integrations, there's actually a thing that can be published just to run the integration, so they won't have access to that back-end stuff that we were just mapping. Literally, all they can do is click Run. So be aware that if you're going to create these and publish them, that's how you would go about doing it. But they do have to be clicked on. It's not going to run by itself. Whereas SmartConnect can run on demand, or it can be scheduled. So it can automatically pull data from various sources and dump it in GP on a schedule. In Integration Manager, it's a one-way sync. It just pulls data into GP. You can't trigger it. With SmartConnect, you can actually have triggers in GP that will run an integration out of GP into another product or pull data in. So you can have an example would be when you create a new customer record, I want it to populate, I don't know, all the addresses. And you can have a trigger that when a new account is created, a new vendor account is created in GP, automatically go ahead and do that. Integration Manager, as I explained at the beginning, you have to be logged into the company that you want to integrate to. You can only do one at a time. With SmartConnect, it does multi-company integration simultaneously. And Integration Manager only does imports, whereas SmartConnect can import and export. And then finally, SmartConnect adds integrations for some of the series that aren't covered in integration managers such as human resources and field service. I'm not sure about manufacturing. I didn't see anything on their website, but one thing to note is that with GP365, we have something called Integration Center, which is a very simple integration tool, but it's meant to integrate into areas of GP that aren't exposed, such as manufacturing and some of the project accounting stuff that's not available in either product. And those are a topic for another day, of course, but it's a different type. Integration Center is not meant to be mapped. Everything is pre-configured for you, and you just literally click run, and it does everything for you. It's a pre-built integration system. So those are the differences between the two products. And with that, I think my demonstration's over, and I can turn it back over to you, John.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. Very helpful, as always. So for those of you that are thinking, these guys are awesome, I need to attend more events, John's jokes are the greatest, well, you're in luck. We run these events pretty regularly, so typically we do 1 or 2 a month. But I wanted to point out 2 events that are coming up because they are particularly, I guess you could say, busy. There's a lot of attendees already registered, and I want to make sure everybody on this call gets a chance to sign up, as each of them is limited to 100 attendees. So we're running a year-end closing training, January 25th, which is going to sort of give you a whole bunch of routines and things that we found over the years to make life a little bit easier at year-end. So make sure you check that one out. The other highly requested session is GP 2018, which was released in December. We're taking a different approach. There's a little bit of content out there already on sort of what's included with GP 2018, but we wanted to, rather than just review those kind of bullet points, instead use the product for a little bit of time and then do a session on sort of what we found, is it worth upgrading to, and so forth. So we're going to do that event in February or early February. So make sure you register to those if you're interested. I think there's probably around 20-ish seats or so left as of this morning. So check those out. And yeah, I appreciate all of you guys joining this one. There's a link there for all of the ones that are after February 1st as well, if you're interested. Okay, one last slide before we sort of take some questions here. And I see a few of you just joined up recently, a little bit late, so hopefully you still got some value out of this. Now, maybe that's a good segue into our blog section. So we try and upload all of the recordings of these webinars when we can. Some of them, unfortunately, have some technical barriers and we're not able to upload them, but we typically do. So if you go to our website and then go to the resource section, you'll see a whole bunch of blogs and videos of previous webinars. So you'll see on the screen, Dynamics GP, how to use revenue and expense deferrals, which was a webinar we did, I guess, a couple months ago. So you can check that out. And we regularly release blogs, probably monthly or so. So it's a great place to sort of check back and get some great tips from how to use GP. Now, of course, shameless plug, it wouldn't be a presentation or a webinar without one. To all of you that joined up that is a current ATOM or GP365 customer, thank you. We really appreciate the business. For those of you who have not worked with us yet, hopefully we get a chance to. GP365 is a very exciting platform and product. I know I only have a few minutes here left, but in a nutshell, GP365 is a completely cloud-hosted version of GP that operates off of a software-as-a-service model. So it comes with free GP upgrades. There's a package that comes with unlimited functional support. There's a variety of apps that we've developed that really extend GP's capabilities and usefulness. So if anyone's interested in that, please do reach out to us. We actually have a promo on for the month of December. So any existing GP customers that have bought or own GP now, you can move over to GP365 at no cost. Now, the one thing I will say is that we have a bit of a waiting list for moving over. We've had a pretty popular demand to our promo. I think we're currently booking sort of end of February for the soonest date that you could transition to GP365. And again, there's no cost for migration if you move over during the month of December. And then we can schedule, the actual go-live date for GP365. So please reach out if you have any interest in that. And I think that's pretty much it. We really appreciate all your time. I do see some questions here that have came in. If anyone has a question, feel free to enter it into the question box, and I'll go over a couple of these questions right now. So we have one, just read this here, one from Jim that says, is there any limit to the number of records that can be imported?
So there is no hard limit to the number of records that you can import, but having said that, I think I mentioned during the webinar that it depending on what you're integrating and the performance of your server, it can take around 3 seconds per record. So, you know, I would probably say if you're up into the 3,000 to 5,000 range, and again, it depends on your server performance, at that point I would split it into files, not because there's a hard limit, but just because the integration might run for so long it's impractical. But the direct answer to the question is there is no limit. It's just a matter of performance on this. Okay, let's see. Sorry, John's disconnected, so technical difficulty here. Just give me 1 second. I'll see if I can get the other questions from him. All right, so the second question was, how can we import manufacturing data into GP? Okay, so the answer to that question is you can't, not with Integration Manager. As I mentioned earlier, with our integration center, we have some integrations to the manufacturing system, but as far as I know, there is no way to import data other than third-party tools, and there are some out there. If you Google it, you might find some. And I'm not 100% sure if SmartConnect does, but definitely Integration Center, which is on the GP365 platform, you can do some integrations with, for example, bill of materials and work in progress and things of that nature. So,
I'm back. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties. Just one of those days. So a big thank you to everybody. I don't see any more questions, but if you do have a question, feel free to email me. My email is J for John, my last name, Posan, P-O-S-A-N, @gp365.ca. Feel free to check out our website. Thank you for all your time, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording link once we get that uploaded.
And the winners.
And the winners.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Take care. See ya.